Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's presentation, 6 Common API Errors, brought to you by Runscope. I'd like to introduce you to our presenters, Heitor, Tashiro, Sergent. Heitor is a Senior Product Manager at Runscope, helping in all of the company content efforts, including writing technical documentation, crafting tutorials and blog posts, and creating customer stories. Prior to Runscope, Heitor worked as a developer evangelist for SendGrid in Latin America, building a strong presence for the company by helping the local developer and startup communities. His experience also includes working as a JavaScript and iOS developer in a few startups and as a mobile game developer in his own startup. Our next presenter is Bryan Whitmarsh. Bryan has been in the software industry for over 25 years, starting out as an engineer, moving into engineering management, then technical sales, and product management. The mobile market is a specific focus for Bryan, as he has been in the mobile industry since the late 90s. Bryan is a Senior Director of Product Management in the Agile Operations Business Unit at CA Technologies. Bryan is primarily focused on external-facing product management activities. As a CA champion, he is very active in the CA communities as well as various public communities.
The focus today is what I really get excited about is a technical discussion. This is not a marketing, it's not a salesy thing. That's why we love these DZone webinars, is because we actually get to talk about technical challenges, solutions to those challenges, and so on. And in our space, we have a lot of experience around APIs. And Heitor is going to get into some more detail about who we are and why we have that experience. But today, we're going to go over 6 of the most common errors in regards to leveraging APIs that we have seen with our customers. We have a lot of different customers. And we're going to go through those kind of systematically. First of all, describing each individual problem, and then we're going to provide a solution to you from 2 different perspectives, 2 different personas. From the actual user, so the API consumer or user of the API, and then we'll talk about solutions for the developers, the folks that are actually writing the APIs, and some recommendations on how to help out with these most common API errors. Now, before we get started, we want to kind of poll the audience. We want to understand kind of your role within the organization so that we can better speak to our audience. So we have our first polling question. We're going to keep you interactive here today. And the polling question, if you wouldn't mind just kind of explaining your role in the organization. So we're mostly talking to individual users, managers, developers, or you don't know what you are or you're other, that's fine. But if you wouldn't mind just taking the time to respond to that, that would be great. We'll just sit here for a couple seconds until I see the poll is no longer in progress, and we can share some results with you.
I'm going to give it a couple more seconds for those last-minute responses, and then I will show the results.
Okay. All right. Okay, great. So we have 48% of you are API developers. That's great. Only 6% are API users. We have some managers, directors, and enterprise architects. So great technical audience. Like I said, we're going to keep this technical and leverage our knowledge in this space to hopefully provide some value add to you today. All right, we can go ahead and close that and continue with the presentation. Heitor, if you want to just kind of let the audience know who we are, why we have this experience, what the heck we do, before we kind of jump into the meat of the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Bryan. So before we jump into the API errors themselves, I just wanted to give some more context of what we're going to talk about. Like Bryan mentioned, this talk, we're going to cover those common API errors that we've seen from customers. From the audience, we're assuming you have some basic knowledge of APIs. So you're familiar with REST, you're familiar with HTTP requests, you're familiar with status codes. You don't have to be, you don't have to have built an API that's used by millions of people. You don't have to have built an API that's used by a Fortune 100 company. If you have done like dozens of API calls, you should be able to relate to most of the errors that we're going to cover here. And like Bryan said, we are going to talk about the errors, and we're going to talk about them from the perspective of API users and from API developers. So it's great to see that we have a lot of API developers in the audience. I think as API developers, you're probably also API users. So you can see that like over 50% of you hopefully will take something away from this talk today. And then, of course, run scope. So who are we? So you might see in the beginning of the presentation the logo for CA Technologies. So we're Run Scope. Run Scope is a product that's part of CA Technologies. It's a company that I was part of before CA acquired it. The acquisition happened about a year ago. And Run Scope is a SaaS-based product, and we're an API monitoring and testing tool. So it means that you can just go to our website, sign up for a free trial, and you can use our tool to make API calls, make sure that your APIs are working and up and performing well. Nowadays we're doing over 11 million API calls a day to all kinds of different APIs. So we help our customers test REST APIs, REST APIs, SOAP APIs, GraphQL APIs, all manners of APIs. And so all these errors, like Bryan mentioned, they come from our experience, personal experience as developers, and also from just listening to feedback from all our customers and helping them, work with APIs that either they built in-house or testing APIs that they are using as third-party APIs. So now I'm going to hand back to Bryan. He's going to start our presentation with our first common API error.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Heitor. First one is, now obviously with 11 million calls per day, we run into just about everything when it comes to different types of API errors. Categorizing it into 6 is a little difficult, but definitely one of the most popular ones is around making the wrong call, whether it's HTTP or HTTPS. And if we look here, what is the problem? If we define the problem, a lot of APIs will either support one or the other. They'll either support just HTTP or they'll support just HTTPS. In a lot of cases, from a security perspective and so on, there's a reason to just support HTTPS, especially when you're doing authentication calls and so on. You want to keep it secure. But there's a lot of cases where from the maturity of an API, sometimes you just start with HTTP just because it's easy, right? You start with it, and then as you gain adoption to it, you get more people requesting for making sure it's secure and so on. And so you have this challenge of starting off HTTP in a lot of cases and then moving to HTTPS. So if you don't support both, there is an inherent problem with that. All right. Additionally, what happens is when you leverage HTTP and then you call a particular API, and let's say that API doesn't support HTTP anymore. Maybe it did at one time, but the developer of the API has said, okay, we're going to have a redirect. Maybe it's a 301, which is a permanent redirect, or a 302, which is a temporary redirect. When you call that API, the API returns said, hey, HTTP not supported anymore. Why don't you go to this URL, HTTPS, whatever the URL is, whatever the redirect is. Now that's hunky and dory, and that's fine, depending on which tool or framework you're using. For example, Node.js does support redirections, and by default, if you look at the documentation, a follow redirect by default is true. Now you can pass parameters to manually set that as true or false, but by default it's true. But there's an exception, and the exception is that the follow all redirects, which would include non-gets, push, deletes, those types of things, by default is false. So if you're trying to do something besides just a basic get, you are not going to be redirected. And so that's definitely a problem we've seen our customers run into. And then if the framework or the tool that you're using just doesn't even support a redirect, we are included in that game because we are a monitoring solution for APIs, and we want you to explicitly, know which APIs that you're testing, what the actual URL you're going to, and so we don't support redirects. So that's another case of the problem where if it just flat out the solution doesn't support it, your users are going to run into problems. All right, now let's talk about some of the solutions. Now, there's kind of going to be this overall boring theme around documentation throughout our presentation. I apologize, but it's just something that's there. Making sure that we read the documentation from a user perspective, and making sure we have an emphasis on documentation from the developer perspective is key for us. So if we're running into problems, typically we just try to do it. If it doesn't work, then we read the documentation. As a user or consumer, if everything works great, well, I got it right. I didn't read the documentation. But when we run into challenges, we need to make sure that we are looking for that documentation. And there's various different areas for you to be able to look for documentation. And it's important to be plugged in to the API provider's community. I can't stress community and the importance of community enough. You guys are developers mostly, and so you obviously leverage the community. Anytime we have problems, we're going out, Stack Overflow, asking the question, figuring out, and seeing other people that have run into challenges. But these communities, by the API owners, they should be able to provide you with updates. Like I said, when things change from HTTP to HTTPS, or all of a sudden an API is depreciated or no longer supported, a good community owners, they will put out those updates. And so if you're tracked in, if you're logged in, or not logged in, but you're subscribed to those communities, you'll get those types of notifications, and that can solve a lot of problems by just making sure that you know about changes when they happen versus your customers. All right, next slide. All right, so now let's get into some of the recommended solutions for the API developer. And again, the theme around documentation here, providing great documentation can solve a lot of support cases, a lot of challenges, a lot of frustration with your customers, your users. And so it's very important to make sure you have a very clear documentation for what your API supports. Does it support both HTTPS and HTTP? Does it only support one? Is there a reason it only supports one? Providing clear documentation is very, very valuable for your customers. The other thing is it's around making sure that we have the ability to provide an easy mechanism for example, for security around the calls. Now, a lot of reasons why these APIs start off as just, non-HTTPS is because, there's an extra step. When you're initially deploying APIs, in order to make them secure, you need to get a certificate. And that certificate process, it's a few extra steps. I remember back in the olden days when it was, a very difficult process to get a certificate on a web server, and everybody hated it, right? It's like, oh, I don't want to do that. And you had this one person in the company that actually knew how to do it, and so you'd wait in the queue until they would actually be able to do it for you. And because of that delay and because of that headache, a lot of times you would just, release your web applications or your APIs without HTTPS, without a certificate in place. Now, there are solutions today to make this much, much easier. One example is Let's Encrypt. Let's Encrypt is a free solution, a great resource, a great tool. It's a recognized certificate authority, so you don't have any problems with, it's not like a self-signing certificate or anything like that. So it makes it much easier for you to, from the start, protect your APIs and provide an HTTPS option for your customers. So that's something, there's a lot of documentation out there that helps. DigitalOcean is one great resource. They have a bunch of articles, videos, and so on about how to easily set up that certificate for your API, for your web server. So, kind of the suggestion here is, try to avoid the quick fix, try to avoid, being lazy. I don't know if we're not lazy, but sometimes we get busy, we want to get these things out. And so it's important to be able to provide a secure option, especially, when you're passing credentials for your API. All right, so that's kind of number one. We see that a lot, just making sure that we're able to tackle and support and know what is supported by the API. All right, the next very common one is unexpected error codes. What do we mean by unexpected error codes? Well, here's a couple examples of the problem. The first one is you make a call and you get this strange message. Now, most of you as developers know, but a lot of us didn't know that there's actually a status code 418. And what is the message returned for a status code 418? It's, I'm a teapot. This was kind of originally put into the spec early on, and it was kind of a joke by the community. And it just stuck. It's still there today, and that is confusing, right? If you make a call and all of a sudden you get an I'm a teapot back from the API response, that isn't a clearly defined response code. So that's not going to help you. So what are some other examples? Other examples are, for example, you make a call, and there are some well-known companies that actually use this practice. They would return a status code of 200, but then provide a message with the error information. Normally, we relate to status code 200, everything's a-okay, everything's great. Now there's a heated debate, and if you go out to Stack Overflow or other communities and say, what's a good practice? Is it a good practice to actually return a a-okay, but with the error in the message? Is that okay or not? And it's kind of like a religion here. Some people say, yeah, it's a great practice. Some people say, it's the worst practice ever. But it is, and it can be very confusing. It's mixed signals here. A 200, typically we search for 200s when we're looking through logs and everything, and so we expect that to be everything's fine. But in some cases, it's not. So what do we do about that? What are some solutions for both the user and the developer? Sorry, back to the documentation theme here. And from an API user perspective, we need to get into those docs. We need to understand, what is the proper syntax? What do we need to have, double check to make sure that, we have the right headers. Maybe we've, spelled some, I'm terrible at spelling, so spell check sometimes will catch things for me, but, I need to make sure that I have set up the headers, the information correctly. These APIs, they can be very fickle. And so you want to make sure that you have the right information from in checking the documentation is step one. What's another solution or example? Here is an example of something that is wrong. If you can take 1 second and just look at this. So it's a GET request. It looks like we're getting messages and we're passing parameters. That looks okay. As a user, what seems to be the problem here? Well, it looks like there is no comma after the page header information. So we're passing query, page, and count, but we have the wrong syntax or the wrong format here. Again, double checking the API, making sure that we have the right information. Now, a great example here is from a developer perspective. So if we switch kind of, what's a good solution for the actual developer of the API or the provider of the application, for example. A great practice is to actually provide inside the documentation a area where users can go and see examples of what the API call should look like. And in fact, I've seen some great examples where you actually have an interface that you can put in, and the product inside the documentation says, okay, these are the required fields. Here's the optional fields. Here's examples of the range of fields that you can provide, and this really helps the user. And then actually being able for them to run that call and see the response inside the documentation. Highly recommend this. This is something that's been very useful, and I've had examples of using this in the past, and it just makes it very simple. That when you see examples, you have the ability to run and see the responses. It helps our customers. What are some other examples here? Other examples of solutions is implementing more status codes. And how many status codes should you implement? That's another question. Let's say at least 3 to start with in this discussion. Let's implement, a 200, everything okay. Let's make sure that we have a 400 and 500. And 400, you can kind of summarize by say, hey, you messed up. And if you have a 500 error, oops, I guess I messed up. So those are kind of 3 big buckets that you at least want to start with. And then as you mature, as more people adopt your API, you can then grow that number of status codes to help specify additional information for your users. Maybe you want to throw out a 301, which says, okay, yes, everything was okay, but when a user is trying to create a resource or so on, it's nice to be able to say, hey, you did successfully complete that, and a resource was created. 301, 302, we kind of already talked about these. These are the the redirects. Anytime that you redirect a user, it's good to provide that status code. And then we may have something about there is a 429, something that you messed up with the syntax, you messed up with the format of the information, and so on. There really is no right answer as to how many is the right number of status codes, but you want to provide at least 3 as a general rule of thumb, and then like we said, continue. The more you add, you're not going to get penalized for giving too much information, and so it's great to be able to provide that. Another an example of someone that does it right. Twilio does a great job of providing the right, verbose information that helps, tremendously helps users and consumers of APIs. Twilio, they are a SaaS service that you can use if you want to be able to provide and leverage messaging, whether it's you want to send text messages, calls, faxes, videos, WhatsApp, those types of things. And so a lot of people use their APIs in order to achieve that messaging solution. And here is one example, and this is how it's done right. Here we have actual individual code, specific code. We have the status information, so status 400 means you messed up somewhere. And then in the message we say, oh, wait a minute, the 2 number is not a valid phone number. That's very detailed information. And a bonus here is they're even providing the link to the documentation for the error. This is great. This takes away a lot of headache from the users and is a great experience and a great practice to follow. All right, I'm going to have Heitor, you want to take it off for the next one, and we'll go over the wrong HTTP method.
Yeah. So the third error is using the wrong HTTP method when making an API call. And that can happen for multiple reasons. Maybe you're, coding and you're copying and pasting code and you copy a GET request and you forget to change to a post. Maybe you're using a tool and there's a drop down and you click on the wrong, method for HTTP and your API just fails. So that can happen, just like, lack of attention sometimes. And then something else that can happen is that the difference between post and put. So if you're familiar with using APIs, you might have seen some cases where an API uses post to create a resource. So let's say we want to create a user. You make a post call to the user endpoint. And then let's say we want to update that user. We want to update the information for that user in the backend. We want to update their email or name or whatever. Instead of making a post request, we'll make a put request. So that's kind of the default maybe that I've seen with multiple APIs. But at the same time, there are APIs that just use post for creating and updating resources, and then put for creating and updating resources. So it's really easy to, make assumptions of how APIs work because of the ones you've worked before. And you're working with a new API and just like say, okay, like I'm going to do a post, create a new user, I'm going to do put and update. And then when you try to do it, things just go really bad. So that can happen is just really trying to make false assumptions and not reading the docs and just go right in like Bryan said, trying to use an API, and so we run into this problem. Something else that can happen, and like Bryan mentioned in the beginning about redirect, when you're making an API call and you're making a GET request, and that gets redirected to another URL, the GET request usually, sticks around and it works and everything works right. But actually, if you're making a post request to an API and that gets redirected, it's very likely that's going to get changed to a GET request. That happens for a few reasons. So basically, GET methods. So when you're trying to use an API and you're using GET requests, there's usually no side effects to making the exact same request multiple times. So if you're trying to get a user from an API and you keep making the same GET request and you make it 100 times, nothing's going to happen, right? Hopefully there's not going to be any side effects of trying to get a user, 100 times. On the other hand, when you're making a post request on API, if you make the exact same request multiple times, that can have side effects into your application, into the backend. So let's say you have a post request for making a financial transaction. If you make that post request multiple times, you can be in a lot of trouble, right? And so because of that, redirects should be on the safe side. Redirects are most often going to redirect any sort of request, get, post, put, delete, to a GET request. So just to be on the safe side. So you really got to be careful and really be aware of what API you're using, what tool you're using, and be careful with the status code that you're getting back when making API requests. So for the solutions, like Bryan said, the solution for this is really, as an API user, is reading the docs. So again, make sure that when you're trying a new API, go to their docs, see how they deal with that difference between post and put, see what they use to create resources, see what they use to update resources, and figure out from there how you're going to put that in your code. If you see everything in the documentation and you're doing things right, using post right, using put right, and things are still going wrong, maybe contact API support. Maybe the people could mess it up in their end as well as like creating documentation. But there's nothing. This one is just really more of an attention matter. As an API developer, what you want to do is really be consistent. So there's I wouldn't say there's a right or wrong answer for using post and put. But whatever you choose with, so if you're going to choose using post for creating resources, using put for update, make sure that you're doing that throughout your whole API. So you're not confusing your users. And so they're trying to create some resources and you have one way to do it, and then they go and try to use another part of the API, and then it's all different. That can be really confusing and really bad for your users. An example for us, actually, so RunScope, our API, we use post for creating new resources. and we use put when modifying them. And then Stripe, which is a processing payment provider, they have APIs that are really popular as well in the developer community. They use post methods when creating and updating objects. So really, there's no right or wrong answer here. Yeah, and again, as an API developer, make sure you're writing good docs. Make sure not only that you're consistent on the back end, but make sure that whatever you decide, you put it in the docs, you make it clear for your users what they have to do, what methods they have to use, and so forth. So, I'm sorry, did someone say something?
No, this is just Bryan. So Heitor, thank you for that. I will take on this one, which is around credentials and authentication or authorization. And we actually get this quite a bit, and we get this typically early on. Many of the API calls require some type of authentication in order to make the call. And when our customers are initially setting up monitoring or setting up testing, they run into challenges with authentication. And what's kind of step one or problem number one that we see? Believe it or not, well, I believe it because I already told you I'm a terrible speller, and sometimes when I'm writing documents, I spell something correctly, but it's the wrong word. And one of the most common things is people passing in the header, they're passing authentication, the word authentication versus authorization. So that's it's a pretty simple one to fix, but sometimes we just look at it over and over and over again, and we say, that doesn't make any sense. It should be working. What's going on? But be very careful with what you're putting in the header, that it is authorization versus authentication. Another problem, especially around OAuth 2 authentication, is not having the right formatting or the spacing when you're making the request. So OAuth 2, you're typically passing a bearer or a token, authentication token, and you have to get the spacing correct. A lot of times we don't even put the word bearer. We'll just put our authentication token, and then realize that we forgot the word bearer. We spelled the word bearer wrong. It's very sensitive here, and you need to make sure that you are passing the right spacing, the right syntax, in order to not run into this issue. Another example for basic authentication here is a lot of times people just forget the word basic right off the bat, or the spacing. Again, the syntax is very critical. When they're providing the username and password, sometimes they won't put the colon in there. Typically, that's not a big deal. If they actually have a username and password, they're going to put the colon in because they know that something needs to go between it. A common problem, for example, if you're leveraging the Stripe API for billing and so on, they don't require, obviously, username and password. You're passing your API key. And so there's only one value in there. Even though you just have one value, with the Stripe API, you still need to make sure you put the colon at the end of that. We've seen that quite a bit. A lot of times, you forget to have the base 64 encoding in front of it. But this authentication piece is very sensitive. You need to make sure that you have the right format, the right syntax. What are some solutions? Coffee. Coffee is a solution for a lot of things. But what we mean here is pay very close attention. Again, we do things a million times, and we look over it. Our mind fills in the blanks for us. Puts in authorization versus authentication, even though it's authentication. We just need to be have very much attention to detail, and pay attention when we're creating our headers and parameters and so on for authentication purposes. And we're back to documentation. Here, showing examples. So not just documenting, making sure that in your documentation you have clear working examples of a working authentication call to the API. That's key, because someone can start and say, okay, we know this is supposed to work. Let's take our specific header information and let's plug in the values and just replace and make that call. Maybe a sample authentication call that works just to show some success, that the users aren't trying to blame the developers or trying to blame the system and say, hey, the authentication is broken. Well, no, here's proof that with this test user, it works. And so we know authentication isn't broken, just the headers or the parameters that you're passing are incorrect. And so it's something you messed up, it's not on our end. And that saves a lot of headache as well.
All right, so I'm going to take the last two errors. So error number 5 is no content type or accept headers. So if you're familiar with APIs and HTTP, there's something called content negotiation. So basically, when a user is making an API call, it's common for the user to include a header that's the accept header. And the accept header is going to tell the server what information the user is expecting. So if you're making an API call when you want the server to return to you an XML, you're going to put an accept header in your call and make sure that it says application XML. So you can put an accept header. You can say that you want XML. You can say that you want JSON. You can say that you want images. It's a way for the user to tell the server what it's expecting back. The content type, on the other hand, is what the server is going to return to you. So the content type is going to say, okay, I got your request. Here's my response. Here's the content type header. And here's what I managed to return to you. So hopefully what you send in the accept header is going to match what you get in the content type header. The problem is that that's not always going to be the case, right? So I think the first problem here is that it's common to forget to include an accept header when you're making an API call. And when you forget to add that accept header, it's like a throw the dice. Sometimes you're gonna get what you want. Sometimes you're not gonna get what you want. So some APIs will accept requests that do not contain the accept header, and they would just default to returning a response in JSON or XML. They just assume that that's what you're trying to get. Some APIs are not gonna return anything. Some APIs are just gonna be like, this is a wrong request. Like, I don't know what you're asking for. So it's really common to just forget the accept header, and then you really get a mix of results when that happens. Another problem here is that, like other problems that we mentioned in back in the presentation, when you're using a certain library or a certain framework or a certain tool, that behavior can vary. So for example, if you're making API calls with curl on the command line, curl will automatically include an accept header, and it says it's the default header that says, here's, I want anything, just like give me whatever you have as a default response. And it's really great because it makes it easy for APIs to just not run into the error of like, oh, there's an accept header missing, like I'm not going to return anything. At the same time, it can be tricky, so it can get you results that you might not want. At RunScope, for example, just like we don't follow redirects because we want users to be explicit in what they're trying to do, we don't add accept headers as well. So if you're using an API and it requires an accept header, and you're using RunScope, you're going to have to add that accept header to make sure that the API call is going to work. So for solutions, as an API user, I recommend being explicit, being crystal clear of what you're trying to do. So if you're making an API call and you're expecting a JSON value back from it, make sure that you add that accept header and that it says application JSON. Don't leave it up to chance. Don't leave it up to whatever tool or framework, whatever mood the tool that you're using is on. just make sure that you add that, and you should get the response that you want back. And so the other solution now for API developers is to try to make things as easy as possible. So I think a lot of APIs will default to returning a JSON as the default if there's an accept header missing. I think as developers, we want to make sure our users are as successful as possible in trying to use our tools. So I would say make it as easy to use for people. And if you're gonna want people to add an accept header, at least make sure that you have a good error message. So make sure that if you require the accept header, don't just give a 400 status code back to your user. Say on the error message, like if you're missing an accept header, please add this. It's gonna make your users' life a lot easier. And as with all the errors that we've touched on so far, I think for users and developers, read the docs, make sure that you read the docs and make sure that in search if the API requires an accept header or not. And as a developer, make sure that you include that information in your docs. Now the last error, and it's kind of related to number 5. The 6th error is invalid content size. So what do I mean by this? And I can just show an example here. This happens if you use APIs. You might have run into this error. You make an API call. You're expecting text, an image, JSON, XML, and you get an HTML page back. You get an HTML error. That can happen, and it's really frustrating when it happens. But just like number 5, this can happen because maybe you miss adding an accept header, and the server doesn't know what you want, so it can assume that maybe you're a browser, maybe you're not, like an application or a tool that's making an API call, so it's just returning you an HTML like a browser would want back. Another problem with this is some tools, not even related to you as a user making something wrong. It's just the way applications and frameworks may have defaults. So, for example, Symfony. I have the logo here. Symfony is a PHP framework. It's really popular. The default for a 500 error with Symfony is an HTML error. So if you don't know that, if you don't know about that default, if you don't go as a developer and switch that up to be a JSON XML response, your users are going to get 500 HTML errors by default. And something even that's not related to APIs that can happen and that can trigger that error is the load balancer or routing mesh that you have in front of your API. So you might be familiar with Nginx. Nginx, if you have Nginx in front of your API and it encounters a timeout error, by default as well, Nginx is going to return an HTML error page for a user. So you really got to be careful with defaults for applications and APIs when you're developing. As a solution, API users, just like we said before, be careful, pay attention to your the API call you're trying to make. Make sure that you're adding the accept header, so you're trying to avoid any defaults that can happen because the server doesn't know what you're requesting. So be explicit of what you want back from the server, and that should hopefully get you out of the water. As an API developer, I think one of the solutions here is really to listen to user feedback. Those errors can be really tricky to find. Like I said, because of default, sometimes we don't run into these errors when we're developing APIs. With the load balancers, like it can be harder to trigger timeouts and really see what's happening. So listen to user feedback, listen to your company support agents. If people bring those errors to you, don't dismiss them and really try to dig into your API and really try to dig into how that could happen. And also, test your APIs. Make sure that you're not only testing your APIs and trying to get 200 status codes back. Make sure that you're testing the API and try to trigger, error codes. Try to trigger 400 error codes. Try to trigger 500 error codes. Make sure that you're testing all the options available that API might return. And so this is it. This is the 6 common API errors that we have for you. Before we wrap things up, we just want to do a second poll. So Billy, if you could help us here.
Just put the poll up. I'll give a few seconds for everyone to put in their answers. Couple more seconds for those last-minute responses. And here are the results.
Interesting. Yep. Logs has kind of been something traditionally we have looked at over the years, and that's kind of been the de facto standard, if you will. Monitoring tools, other people and customers. Great. Thank you very much for your involvement. I'll just kind of wrap it up with a link here. We do have a free trial, so if you were interested in what we talked about today, if you want some further visibility into monitoring of your APIs, if you're new to API development or API usage, it's very easy to get signed up for a free trial of our solution. Our solution will make these calls for you and show you all the results. And so you can get familiar with the responses, the response codes, the payloads, all that. And there's a bunch of free APIs out there that you can just practice with. We use the deck of cards, which is a fun little API that's available. It doesn't require authentication and lets you do fun things like shuffle the deck of cards and draw cards off the deck and verify that the dealer's not trying to hide any cards and has X number of cards remaining after you take 2 off the deck, and so on. So that's a fun resource to become familiar with monitoring solutions as well as APIs in general. So in closing, just wanted to thank everyone. If we had any questions at this time, it would be a great time to feel free to reach out either through the online Q&A component, or you can ask questions online if you'd like. Let's pause. Billy, do we have any queued questions?
We do. Our first question is, if a user exists because of multiple submits, should the API return a 500 error or a redirect?
So could you read that question again, Billy, please?
Yeah. If the user exists because of multiple submits, should the API return a 500 or a redirect?
Okay. Yeah, that's complicated because you don't know what the user is really trying to do when making multiple API calls, right? So the user could be trying to create multiples of the same user for some reason. So I would say probably keep it as a redirect. Maybe have a limit on how many of the same users the API can actually create. And after that limit is hit, then you start returning 500. I think that would be one way to do it. Like I said during the talk, APIs are not like a black and white thing. There's different ways to do things, but that would be my opinion.
Awesome. Our next question is, which of the errors have you seen most often?
Personally, I've seen a lot of errors with authentication that Bryan covered in the presentation. Yeah, just because it's really easy. I've done that myself. Like wrote authentication instead of authorization. I don't know how many times. Um, Misspelled there. And also because I feel like that's the first step when you're trying to use a new API. And those are usually the first steps are usually when you're making the most mistakes.
And it's so unique because everyone's API seems like there's a special format or a special header that needs to be passed or special syntax, and so it's not completely standard across all APIs. So it definitely does you need to know the specific syntax for the specific API for authentication. So yeah, it's something that even though we're very familiar with it, if we call a new API that we need to know the specific syntax for that API.
Great. Our next question is, as an API developer, how can I prevent these errors from happening?
You want to take this one, Bryan, or do you want me to answer?
You can take it. Yep. I mean, there's really no good answer. You can't really prevent it, right? You can just adapt and adjust to it. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I think as an API developer, it's really hard to prevent errors. I think the best job you can do is really provide good error messages. So as more people use your API and you have logs, for example, like a lot of people had logs here, you use those logs to see what errors are the most common, and then try to help those people by creating custom or creating helpful error messages. So if you see a lot of people are running into errors with your API during the authentication, during the authorization step, try to be helpful as an API developer, and say give a clear error message. Say like you misspelled, you forgot the authorization header, you misspelled the authorization header, you forgot your API token. So try to be as specific as possible so people can help themselves and write good documentation.
Great. Our next question is, what are some tips to make it easier to write and deploy documentation?
I know documentation, like a lot of developers might not, documentation is not the first thing they want to do when they wake up and have coffee in the morning. But yeah, I think some things that can help, using a specification for API that can be helpful for document, not only for documentation, but for multiple things. But when you have like for example, Swagger or OpenAPI specification, that's gonna, if you have the file with the specification for API, there are tools out there that can help you get a head start when creating your documentation. So they can import that file and give you like a nice HTML page that's gonna have all the methods that your API supports, all the responses, all the properties, and they can even include in the documentation itself a way to run those API calls, just like Bryan was mentioning. So yeah, that is one way you can have a head start. I think having that is a great start, right? Having all the properties that your API supports, all the methods, that's a great start. And then after that, you can start doing things more manually and writing tutorials for people to accomplish specific things with your APIs. So creating a user, doing a financial transaction, sending a text message. I feel like you need both. You need both the API reference that you can get from a specification and then specific tutorials for doing specific things.
Yeah, I think that actual ability to actually run a test or run a call, run a get, or whatever, it speaks volumes as to making it easier, so you don't have to provide as much documentation. When people get their hands on it, they actually see a successful call. They can then simulate that successful call with their API call. So I think that's huge for documentation to provide those examples, as well as the ability to actually run a test command. Anything else?
Our next question is, what if our services are interacting internally and we have only one endpoint to customers, which is HTTPS, and then do we need to get HTTPS for our microservices interacting internally for computation?
I didn't understand the question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so this basically you have one in your you have one entry point. That entry point you have your certificate authority on. You have your certificate on. So you have a secure connection between the outside person and your web server, and then behind that, internally, are where your actual API calls are. So it's an architectural discussion.
I'm sorry. I'm still.
Yeah, we might need to respond offline on that one. We'll get the information and respond.
Great. Our next question is, how do I get one of your t-shirts?
Awesome. we get this request all the time. We have some pretty cool t-shirts to say everything's going to be 200 okay, and they're one of the most popular things on our digital marketing campaigns. So I'm glad to see it's got some popularity here. If you sign up for trial and run some tests and send me an email, let's put my email address up there, Bryan .Whitmarsh, WHITMARSH @ca.com. You just email me your tenant, and I will send you a t-shirt. Tell me what size and where to mail it. So that's Bryan .Whitmarsh, WHITMARSH @ca.com. They're very comfortable t-shirts. as my colleagues know on my webcam, they're like, do you wear the same t-shirt every day? I'm like, no, I have 5 or 6 of them. I wash them every once in a while.
Looks like that's all the time we have for questions. Bryan or Heitor, do you want to add anything before I close things off?
Yeah, no, I just appreciate everybody's time and, encourage you to go out, check out free trial, play around. If you're not familiar with these error codes that we talked about or how to interact with them, feel free to use our system as kind of a test environment for you to become educated and to learn more about how to handle these common API errors. So thank you very much for your time today, and look forward to having some future discussions.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank Heitor and Bryan for a great webinar presentation today. I'd also like to thank today's sponsor, RunScope, for providing the DZone audience with a great webinar presentation. And lastly, thank you to everyone who joined us today for the presentation. We hope you learned something new that will help you in your developer career. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.